All right. We are on lesson 14 in your book. That's page 34. And we're not doing a PowerPoint tonight because there is so much reading. We just really want to focus on that. We're going to be reading quite a bit, which means you're going to need a lot of readers. And when you read, we're going to make sure that we use the microphones. So I got Peyton Long and I've got John Clemens running mics for me tonight. And we'll get there in a minute. You could be turning your Bibles to John 10. We're going to start off there, John chapter 10, and we'll be there for a little while, and then we'll move on from John. Let's start off with a prayer, and since Peyton Long is one of our runners, I'm going to have him lead us in prayer, and then we'll get started. Peyton?
Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this wonderful night you've given us, Lord, and the opportunity you've given us to come together and come here and learn more about you, God, and study the Bible. Lord, please bless this class, Lord, and Lord, please help us to apply what we learn to our everyday lives. And in your Son's holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, we're going to start off in John chapter 10, reading verses 7 through 14. We're not going to read all of this John 10 text, but 7 through 14. So, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to see if Terry Reed, are you there in John 10? We'll start with Terry Reed. John's bringing you a mic. Verses 7 through 14.
So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep do not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and destroy, kill and destroy. I came and they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolves coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and a wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me."
All right, so there's quite the contrast in that text between a good shepherd and a hireling. And the question just starts off with, what quality is implied in that passage about the faithful shepherd as compared to the hireling? So what's the quality there that is implied? Raise your hand so we can get a mic to you. And I want to make sure everybody at home can hear you, because I know you got a great comment. So who's going to answer that for us? Okay, Daryl?
The shepherd cares about the sheep, whereas the hireling doesn't. Basically, it's the thought that I thought he said.
Okay, all right. I think that's the essence of the answer, truthfully. Anybody else have any answer to add to that? I think that gets right at the heart of it. There is a care there. I think if we're not careful, we may look at that, by the way, with our kind of modern American minds and think that that care is largely a financial thing, because the shepherd has a financial investment in the sheep, the hireling does not. But I want to make sure we understand it's deeper than that. It's not just about money. This is about a relationship that the shepherd has. In most cases, probably he knows his sheep, might have even named his sheep in that sense. And so there's more of a relationship than just the financial investment about that. Dave, we need to get a mic over there.
There was a man that went to our church that I grew up in. His name was Henry Horton. Henry was an awesome person, had a great family, just passed away a few days ago. But you were talking about that. He was like that with his cattle. He had over 50 head of cattle, but he named each one of them. He cared deeply, and they knew him, and he had a close relationship with them. I didn't understand it, just not, being around them all the time. But like you said, it was a deep care. Yeah. And showing that by naming each one of them was something that was unique and neat to witness.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we've been focusing so much on shepherds in the last couple of weeks, and specifically relating shepherds to the eldership. I did want to make an application real quick, just beyond the eldership, that all the things we talk about shepherding, while we're looking at this specifically as applied to the leadership within a church, shepherd-style leadership is a good style of leadership, period. But I think one of the ways we see this kind of leadership that is needed today is in the home, that fathers are shepherds of their home in a sense. And there's a lot of, if you'll notice especially I think tonight, a lot of the things that we'll talk about that shepherds do, that the kind of quality of heart they have is the same kind of heart that a father needs to have in regards to his children. By the way, that would make sense, right? Since one of the things that Paul points out is that essentially the home is the training ground for the elder. That the way he leads in his home, and we'll get into that later in the study, but the way he leads in his home is an indicator of how well he can and should lead the Lord's church in that role. Shepherds for us are probably not that common. I don't know of a lot of shepherds around Chelsea. I know some of you have goats, so that's the closest thing, but goats are a little different than sheep. And so I think there's a difference there. Maybe Malachi is a shepherd to his puppies. I don't know. They seem to follow him an awful lot if you see videos of that. But true shepherds is probably something that's a little different for us. How would you know who a shepherd was? Yeah, the smell. Sheep have a distinct smell that would get onto the shepherd. Some things that have to do with the wool and the chemicals that are there to protect them. It rubs off on the shepherd. It was a very distinct smell. And so when a shepherd walked in, you knew he was a shepherd. It's much like I grew up kind of in a high school that was on a side of town where they were building, but they hadn't completely taken up all the land, so we had a bunch of rich kids, just to kind of be over stereotyping, over generalization, but we also had a really strong FFA. And one year in pre-algebra, I got to sit behind a guy who worked his farm every morning before he came to school and did not change his boots. And that was first period. And so there was a smell that you knew. By the way, he didn't have to wear his FFA jacket to know that he was in FFA, right? And shepherds would have been kind of the same experience. Now, historically, shepherds, and I think this is what's interesting, we're kind of elevating the shepherds to kind of this kind of role to be honored. And we look at David and we look at Moses, and we even see, not too long ago, we saw Rachel was a shepherdess. We look at these different shepherds in the Bible, and we kind of elevate them to kind of this thing to be respected and honored, but truthfully, it was not really something to be honored. And if you smelt that way, it was not something that people went, oh, you're a shepherd. It was more like, ooh, he's a shepherd. Stay away from him. I've referenced the book, by the way, by Dr. Lynn Anderson called They Smell Like Sheep, which is a great book for anybody in leadership to read, especially those who would like to serve as elders, because it is based on this idea. And it's part of what we're getting at in today's lesson, that to truly shepherd sheep, you have to be among the sheep. And I think that's one of the things that needs to be pointed out before we get in any further. Again, we think of livestock, we think of things like cattle, and we think of goats, and we think of the way we raise livestock today. How do we raise livestock today? If you have livestock, what do you also have for your livestock? What's that? Dogs? Okay, what else? Something really important. You have land that has a fence around it to keep and maintain your livestock. In the first century, they shared pasture land. And so it would be very common for 3 or 4 flocks to find themselves together. Which, by the way, ties into Jesus' application of that the sheep know the voice of the shepherd and they come. So one of the reasons we have land and fencing is what? How do we shepherd our sheep or our livestock, really, cattle or whatever? How do we shepherd them? We put a fence around them. And we corral them and we keep them in. And that's what we do. And that's not how that was handled back then. Back then, there were times where they would put them in caves or they would put them in places that could contain them. But even then, most of the time, somebody stayed with the sheep overnight. And so you see this direct interaction. You see this 24-hour care. It is quite different than what we're used to. And that's why it makes such a great application as well. But also, if you're a shepherd that had been with your sheep, let's say for a couple of days in a row, you've not been home, you've not changed clothes, you've not showered or bathed, what do you think that smell's going to be like? It's going to be pretty bad. And that's kind of the idea here. So this is a great lesson. It's a frustrating lesson, too. I'll tell you why it's frustrating is because it's so much of a fill-in-the-blank lesson. I don't know if that frustrates you as much as it does me, but we're going to try to have some good discussion along the way. So we begin in John 10 and verse 13, and we've already read that, John 10 and verse 13. What is the action here? What does the shepherd do in John 10 and verse 13? And Daryl's kind of hit on this already. What would be in that blank? Cares, okay? He cares about the sheep. And that seems to be a rather simplistic thing, caring about sheep, right? What does that mean then for somebody who serves as a shepherd in the church? Raise your hand. I got Charlie over here, if we get a mic to him.
The shepherd of biblical times protected the sheep, watched over them because they were extremely vulnerable.
Right.
Unlike any other farm animal, the sheep is the one that is the least able to defend itself other than the rams. But the wool-growing sheep is just not, he's not athletic, he's not particularly strong. So that's the connection to the congregation as a shepherd of the flock, is that the flock is weak, and we always will be. And we need the strength of that shepherd to help us and to watch over us. But should we drift too far off, then the shepherd should be there. Shepherd should be there to help bring us back in.
Yep. Very good.
That also leads to the age-old problem that all of us feel like we ought to be able to direct our own lives. And so now you get a group of people and somebody comes to help and you say, what is he doing coming over here and messing in my life?
Right.
So that's the scenario of all of this.
Sure. And everything that you said springs forth out of this heart that cares for the sheep, right? The protection, the meddling, also you say meddling in people's lives out of concern. All of that has to do with caring. And when somebody takes on the role of shepherding in the church, they are taking on a tremendous burden because they're agreeing now to care for every single soul that is a part of that congregation. In addition to the care they're already giving to their family, in addition to the care they're already giving to whatever friends they may have that they care deeply about, they're taking on this burden of every single person that they are going to then focus on, and to the best of their ability, they're going to develop a deep-rooted relationship where they have that person's well-being at the forefront of their mind all the time. And I will tell you, that is a tremendous burden when it is taken appropriately. And this is, by the way, this is why this study is really needed, I think, is to understand that true shepherding that cares that way is difficult. So we as sheep, our response needs to be to them with an understanding of how much of a burden that is. But the other thing I want you to know is I think that also plays a role historically why so many elderships don't shepherd is because it is way easier to make eldering about watching bank accounts and being administrative over decisions than it is to actually care about souls and try to protect and take care of souls. And those are two tremendously different focuses. And one is far easier than the other. And that plays a role in all of this. Well, verse 14 goes along with this a little bit, but verse 14, the shepherd what? Blank. The shepherd blanks the sheep. What should go in that blank? Knows. He knows his sheep. Is that difficult to do? Yeah? Got to be up with their business, okay? Is it hard to know everybody? It's easier to know some things about some folks, right? And I could go around the room and pick on people, right? I mean, about things that stick out. Like, we all know that Charlie was a photographer. If you talk to Charlie, you know, which he's got great stories. If you didn't know that, Charlie's a photographer, right? And that's a part of his identity. Did you know Eric lived in Germany? Speaks fluent German. How many people know that Eric speaks fluent German? Fluent, he would say not fluent. More than me. How about that? Because he'll say stuff in German, I'll just look at him like, right? Now that's silly things, right? But at the same time, knowing the sheep does involve things like, where do they live? I mean, think about that. Our flock is literally scattered all over the place. We've got people that are up technically in the Vestavia area and Hoover area, and we got people down, near Wilsonville and all over and in between, right? We got people that are retired, people that are still working, people that don't have jobs. Should shepherds try to know as much of that as possible? Yeah, absolutely. Why is that the case, by the way? Why should shepherds know those kind of things? Anybody have any ideas about that? Okay, Ginger says can't have a relationship with him if you don't know those things, and that's true. May not know when they're falling away or why they're falling away. And I think that's one of the things to understand is that knowing the sheep sometimes allows you to understand things that are happening better. And yet, because I got to tell you, when you don't know the sheep and you just see somebody that's not attending, you may jump to a conclusion, well, this person's just unfaithful, and they may not be attending because their mother's in hospice and they've been sitting with her for 6 weeks waiting for her to die. You don't know that as a shepherd. You failed at your job. And so knowing the sheep is important. What about their needs, right? What about their weaknesses? What about their strengths? Now, why would it be important to know the sheep's strengths as a shepherd in the Lord's church? Why is that important? Because part of the shepherd's job is to move you from the pew to some form of action. And the most effective way to do that is to use your strengths to get you involved. All those things play a role in knowing. Okay, that's going to wrap up John 10. Let's turn over to Luke 2. Anybody have anything to add to that section there before we move on? Luke 2 in verse 8. Luke 2 in verse 8. I'm going to get Dave to read that. If you'll take the mic to Dave. I'm just going to voluntold him. Luke 2, verse 8.
And in the same region there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night.
What are they watching for, Dave?
They're looking for wolves or something that could threaten the sheep.
Yeah, any kind of predator. And the most common predator, at least biblically speaking, is wolves. And we're not going to turn to Acts 20, 28 through 31. Hopefully you did that. But Acts 20, 28 through 31 mentions specifically, and here as he is getting ready to go to Rome, as Paul's going to Rome, he meets with the elders at Ephesus, and he tells them that their job is to do what? To watch over the flock, and specifically to watch out for savage wolves. Now, what would a savage wolf be in relation to the Lord's body? Raise your hand so we can get that on a, people can hear you. We don't have to be scared of the mic, by the way, because nobody can see your face. So, it'd be different if we were putting you on camera. Dave?
I think a savage wolf, in that context, I think would be someone that is looking to pull them away from the flock, and in the worst case could be to inflict harm and to tear them down and to hurt them.
I think we automatically jump with wolves to the idea biblically of a false teacher, and I think that is one form. But the greater issue is anybody who comes into the flock and seeks, and doesn't even have to seek, but I think intentionally or unintentionally becomes destructive and divisive, and they cause problems within the flock, the shepherds have to deal with that. And if shepherds are doing their job, they should deal with that before they're divisive and destructive, which goes back to knowing sheep. And that's part of one thing, by the way, all the things we mentioned about knowing sheep are really about your physical characteristics or your background, but a part of knowing sheep is also knowing what people believe, what's their thoughts, how do they view the scriptures. And what things do they hold, views, and how does that impact the church? All of that's part of knowing the sheep. And how the shepherds respond to that is extremely important in that sense. Now, in Acts 20, you may remember there was an added exhortation there that he warns them that some of these wolves could come from themselves as elders, that they could be divisive and destructive. And one of the things I want to point out, by the way, and here's an important point about elderships. Who are the elders accountable to? But we're all accountable to God. Who else are the elders accountable to? Aren't they accountable to the other elders? You ever thought about that? I mean, if you have elders, the elder individually is still accountable to the eldership. And that plays a role here in Acts 20. In other words, let's say you have 5 elders, and let's say they agree to something, but one of them just decides he's not going to do that. Is he allowed, because he's an elder, to decide he's not going to do something? Or does he have to submit to the eldership like every other member? I think one of the hard things for us to kind of put into our minds is that elders are still parts of the flock, even though they're elders. Their wives are still members of the flock. Their children are members of the flock. They're accountable to the elders, plural, okay, individually. And ultimately, yes, they're accountable to the chief shepherd, and so are we. But there's a point to be made there as well. Because in Ephesus, what happened is, let's say there's 5 elders there. What if one of them starts being destructive and divisive? What do the other 4 elders have to do? Hold him accountable and watch out for the sheep. He doesn't get a free pass because he's an elder. He doesn't get to be a wolf because he's an elder. He has to be held accountable just like everybody else. And so from that standpoint, I think one of the things to keep in mind is all of us, even the elders, are accountable to the eldership, to the shepherds in that sense. And that's kind of difficult, I think, to get. And Acts 20 really paints that picture when we understand that. Let's turn to Psalm 78. Psalm 78. Psalm 78 will be in verses 52 and 53. Hey, Peyton, take that to Jonathan Balaam. I'm going to make him read for us. Psalm 78. Walk slow so we can find Psalms. 52 and 53, Jonathan.
Then he led out his people like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them in safety so that they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies.
All right, what two things does he do here? Jonathan, I'll let you answer that real quick. You read it, you can answer it for us.
He brought them to safety.
Okay?
Let's see, and he guided them.
Yeah. 52, lead and guide them are probably the two single word answers he's looking for in this blank, I would imagine. He leads and guides them. If we were to go back to John 10, we've looked at this before. How does the shepherd lead his sheep? Is he behind them or in front of them? He's in front, and they follow him. So he's leading them, he is guiding them. What does that mean he's doing for the church? What does that look like? Is that making decisions and saying, here's how y'all are supposed to behave? Or what is it? In fact, 1 Peter 5 kind of paints this picture. I was kind of surprised he went to Hebrews 13:17 instead of Hebrews 13:7 instead of 1 Peter 5. What does that mean? What does the shepherd do in the church context in order for them to follow? Think about that, what I just said. Follow. Verse 7 that ends with, Hebrews 13:7 says that you to do what? What's that? Anybody have that? Nope, that's verse 17. Verse 7, imitate their faith. Yep, examples. So what this is speaking to is that the elder should be an example to the flock. That leading and guiding the flock is not pushing them. It's not giving a bunch of directives about, here's what you're going to do. It's leading the way by example. So, an elder doesn't get up and tell everybody they've got to teach. What does he do? He becomes a teacher. Okay? An elder doesn't tell people, hey, you've got to go talk to your neighbor about souls. What does the elder do? Talks to his neighbors about souls. Now, can he admonish us to teach and to evangelize? Yes. But not if he doesn't have the example and lead by example first. And that seems to be the idea here in that sense. Okay, page 35, we'll go over there. We'll be in Psalm 23 now. Psalm 23. And truthfully, we probably could have done half the lesson on Psalm 23 as far as all the things that the shepherd does for his sheep. Let's read verses 1 and 2 from Psalm 23, verses 1 and 2. Daryl, are you there in Psalm 23? Can you turn there while Peyton's coming up? I'll let you read for us. Psalm 23. And then, John, go ahead and hit Chuck up with the mic because he's going to read next. We'll just get that out of the way.
1 and 2.
1 and 2.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters.
Okay? What do you think goes in that blank there? The shepherd seeks the blank for the sheep. What's that? Trust. Okay, that's one. What else?
The best.
Best. I think maybe best goes, best fits that blank. How about that? He makes me lie down in green pastures. He restores, leads me beside still waters. There's some interesting things here, by the way. If you've never read Timothy Keller's look into the 23rd Psalm, the shepherd's perspective of the 23rd Psalm, I encourage that. There's a lot of stuff in there, and some of that stuff, you know, you may read, and I read and go, okay, you may go too far about some of that stuff, because there's some conflicting things. But there's some things in there that are really amazing. This leading me beside still water, you know, we just read that and we think, oh, he just goes and finds a nice brook. But that's not really what the shepherd would do. What the shepherd would have to do a lot of times, because what's wrong with sheep and water, by the way? Anybody know what's wrong with sheep and water?
Can't swim.
They can't swim. Why can't they swim?
Too much wool.
Because that wool soaks up all the water and they're going to die. They're going to drown. And so what happen would be is that the shepherd would go ahead and he would go to the brook, and if the brook had rushing water, he would build a dam to slow down the water so that the sheep would have still waters to drink from. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? And so you think about that. You think about leading in paths of righteousness, that the right wayness, if you will. He knew the right way to go. He didn't let the sheep dictate where they went. He went. And even later in here, this idea of preparing a table before me in the presence of my enemies, a lot of times a shepherd would have to go up onto the land and prepare the land to make sure there weren't any weeds that could poison us. And also there's sheep are bothered by flies. A lot of stories from that time of putting oil on the sheep's head to keep the flies from bothering them. Checking the pasture land for snakes, which, by the way, is also a predator. Not that it would kill it, but it would harm them. So you think about all these things. This shepherd's having to do all of this all the time. Check the land, check for weeds, anoint the oil, shut down any rushing waters with a dam to make it still. What does that tell you then? What does that mean in respect to time with the shepherds?
Heavy investment.
It's a heavy investment of time. It takes a whole lot of time to shepherd a flock. Now, where that gets really difficult is for these shepherds in the Bible, this is their full-time job. What do? We give this role to somebody who's already working 60 hours a week to pay for his bills, and we say, good luck, right? And I tell you one thing to just take from that is, a lot of times we may look at what the shepherds are doing and go, why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing this? And I'll just tell you, because I think I'm about 15 years of working full-time with shepherds, which has been a blessing. The reality is, most of the time, A, you don't know what all they're doing because they're not going to tell you everything. There's a lot goes on that is private. But B, they are usually doing a lot more than you would ever imagine and simply sometimes doing the best they can with the circumstances they've been given. Because it is extremely time-consuming. Extremely time-consuming. All right, 1 Samuel 17, 34 through 36 is going to get into some of this as well. So, Chuck, read that for us.
But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. All
right. First off, I don't know if you paid much attention to this, but we always laud how great Samson was. And here's David, kind of doing the same thing Samson does, right? Killing with his hands, or a stone, a sling, I'm sure as well, lions and bears that have attacked his flock. Now, the shepherd does what for the sheep here in this passage?
Protects.
Yeah, this is the protection passage. What does that tell you about the kind of men that need to be shepherds? I'm going to tell you, this is something I probably hadn't thought of as much as I did today. But what does that tell you about shepherds, their personality? Anybody have any ideas? Okay, Gina's got an idea here, John.
I went back and read what the reference he gave in Titus, and in order to protect, I felt like they needed to be men well-grounded in sound doctrine,
Okay.
able to correct those who contradict, self-controlled, and not quick-tempered.
Okay. All good. Anybody else? Got Jonathan over here.
Say a couple of things, but there's a decisiveness there, but there's also a boldness that's rooted in faith, a fearlessness that they know they're doing the right thing.
Yes. Which, by the way, I think we struggle sometimes, and both of you had great comments. But then we look at something like not quick-tempered, and we've got to balance that, though, with the firmness and decisiveness and boldness to stand when you've got to stand, and to, for lack of a better term, to fight when you've got to fight. Is there a time when an elder or a shepherd or shepherds have to be aggressive in order to protect the flock? Yeah. Can they do that without being quick-tempered? Yes. But we have to be careful that we don't take quick-tempered to mean that they're not still aggressive when needed to be aggressive. Sometimes we kind of get that stuff a little confused. Look, just to be very clear, when somebody's coming in and trying to be divisive and destroy the church, the shepherds are going to have to be willing to stand longer and stronger than the one who's trying to be divisive. And so that's going to take some strength and decisiveness and boldness. It's going to take being rooted in the Scriptures to be able to make the right things. It's also going to take some aggression to be willing to make that decision. Quite frankly, one of the ways that that is most often seen in my experience is to start earlier in the process of stopping the problem. Because sometimes we want to just kind of sit back and wait for it to see if it works itself out. And the problem is, if a lion is or a wolf or a bear is allowed to be in the flock for a while, they're going to devour some sheep before you make that decision if you're not careful. Which leads us to the next section of Luke 15, 4 and 5. We're not going to read this. I think most of us know the story. It's the parable of the lost sheep. The shepherd searches for the what and what sheep? What two words did you put in there? What's that? Missing and lost. Anybody else have anything else? Yeah, maybe wandering and lost from the standpoint that one of those is the process of starting to get lost and the other one is finally being lost. And that gets to what I just said. You got to understand, sheep are going to wander. Shepherds can't wait always until they're lost to decide to do something. Sometimes that decision, and all the time, that decision needs to be made sooner. So the question was, how quickly do you think shepherds should respond when they see a sheep straying? What would y'all put for that? Janie? Immediately. I mean, the moment there is a sign that something is not right, the shepherds have to do something. They have to do something. Get Charlie and Mike, and I'll say this. I know of situations where sheep have been lost for well over a year before shepherds have ever addressed that particular sheep. And what happens is, by the time you go and say anything at that point, you're wasting your breath and your energy. You've missed your opportunity. Because as shepherds, if you let those sheep be gone for years, in some cases, and then all of a sudden you show up and want to say you love me, what do I think? You didn't even miss me for 2 years. How can you say that you love me? And all that plays a role in that. Charlie?
Being a Tennessee, I'll forgive you. You know a bit about football,
Well,
and
people
you
say
know a
that I
bit
don't, 'cause I'm a
about
Tennessee fan.
Bear Bryant.
Yes.
And I will tell you that there was a side of Bear Bryant that was, well, let's just say it was unmentionable.
Right.
And one of the things, though, that always amazed me was that if I ever tried to have a discussion like that with any of his former players, they would say, oh, I don't know anything about that. He loved us. And if you look at his disciplinary positions, if you look at all of that, he loved those players, and he would do whatever was necessary for his teammates, even to the extent of not letting someone play because they missed practice due to illness. But he wanted to influence his flock about how things are done and are not done. And it really, I think it really just boils down to love. I mean, it's a pure the shepherd is a pure example of loving his flock
Yep.
to
Yep. Good comment. Final one is in Hebrews 13:17. We got about 5 minutes left. What does the shepherd do for the sheep there? Hebrews 13:17 says that each one will give this. He accounts for them. He accounts for them. And ultimately, to whom do shepherds in the church give account? Ultimately, the answer here is the chief shepherd. Okay? And we mentioned this earlier. Of course, all of us do that. But again, there is a sense where shepherds are to give an account to their fellow shepherds. And we've already talked about that. Now, all this, the question is, does this leave you with the impression that elders are merely decision makers for the church? Yes? No? In fact, with the exception of the decision making to how to handle the sheep, most of the decisions that we look at elders making a lot of times when they act as something other than shepherds really aren't in anything we looked at tonight. For example, where would bank account watching fit into all these qualities that we saw tonight? It's just not there. Now, you could argue that perhaps existentially, if some member is trying to use funds in a way that is doctrinally unsound, that then they need to get involved. But even then, that's not about the bank account as much as it's about the person who's doing something that's divisive. I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at this, the shepherd's focus is on the care and protection and the feeding and the leading and the guiding of the sheep. That's what the shepherd is focused on. Which, by the way, is interesting because I heard somebody say the other day in a conversation about elders, when I was growing up, you know what really we looked at the most to decide who should be elders in the church? Okay, wives and children was first, and I think I've said this before, but I'll say it today, because that's so quantifiable. Like, rather than me making some subjective judgment about whether a man's hospitable or a good teacher, I can count how many times he's been married and how many kids have been baptized. And that's just easier to make that judgment that way, right? And quite honestly, each passage about qualifications has 15 in each. 5 are the same, 5 are close enough, 5 in each are different. So if you just look at 20 qualifications total, if you just want to throw them in a pot that way. For years when I was growing up, we didn't pay attention to any of that stuff. We paid attention to how many wives, how many kids I had. And then there was this other factor, at least from a lot of times, which was his business success. If he was a leader at work, if he was a vice president of a company, if he was rich, if he had a good portfolio, if he was successful in earthly terms, then he was elder material as long as he had the right number of wives and kids. Where is that in this? I mean, what's interesting is in this society, these guys are the least successful people around. People don't want to be shepherds. They don't want to look like them. So it's really the exact opposite of what we often do. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that somebody cannot be wildly successful at business and still have a shepherd's heart. But the point is that they have a heart like what we looked at tonight. They have these kind of qualities that we looked at tonight. Along those lines, this was asked for a question for us to consider. 4 things a man can do to make sure he's cultivating a shepherd's heart. Now, this is an open-ended question. We have like 2 minutes for this, really a minute and a half at this point. You could say lots of things. I'm going to give you my 4, and we'll probably be out of time. But I think these 4 things just really play a role here. First off, if somebody wants to serve in this role, they should first begin developing these kinds of traits. Ultimately, they begin that in their home with their children, okay? But they also practice these traits even within the local body. They see somebody that is starting to wander. They get involved. They try to stop that person from wandering. By the way, if you see somebody that is going to wander and stray, you have a responsibility, if you have that knowledge as a sheep, to try to keep them from straying as well. We don't just abandon that strictly to the shepherds. Secondly, learn these principles, and maybe those two should be reversed, but learn the things we talked about. Learn these shepherding principles. Third, watch other people who are already good at this and learn how they do it. And one of the things that I think is great that has happened in the last 10 years that I know of, maybe a little bit longer, is there are a lot of churches that are really good at this, who other churches have actually even had some of those shepherds come in and work with them and to sit down and to talk about, and workshop kind of style, to talk about how to shepherd the church correctly. And so if you're aspiring to do this, learn from other people. And then finally, develop communication and relationships with the sheep. Start knowing the sheep well before you're a shepherd. In fact, I got to tell you, I don't think somebody's really qualified to be a shepherd if they never start knowing the sheep until they're appointed. That really needs to begin before. And I've had people come up to me, not here. I've had people come up to me and go, "Who's that guy over there?" I'm like, "Well, he's been a member here 6 months." And I just got to tell you, that's embarrassing. That's embarrassing that somebody's been a part of a flock for months and a shepherd doesn't know who they are, doesn't know their name, let alone anything about them. So again, just to go over, I'll reverse those first two. Learn these principles, begin developing these principles, watch and observe other people and learn how to do these principles, and finally, develop relationships and communicate with the sheep. I don't think I'm teaching next week. Daryl's teaching next week, lesson 15. That's Daryl's alley, power steering or power brakes. He's all about the motors. So, yeah. Well, we're looking forward to it. Thanks for joining in at home and joining us tonight. We're dismissed.